Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Keeping an eye on what's happening across the swing states today. Donald Trump going to appear in Michigan and later on Wisconsin, while the Democratic ticket is wrapping up its second day of its bus tour in Georgia. That's what Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have been doing since yesterday. They will, of course, sit down later today, actually in about 45 minutes, for an interview, the first big one they will have done since they became the Democratic ticket on CNN, set to air at 9 p.m. Eastern time. And then, of course, they will have a big rally in Savannah to wrap up their tour of the Peach State. And it comes at a time in which they are polling better in the Peach State, or at least Harris is doing better than Biden was at the time that he dropped out of the race. So let's get into what's going down in Georgia and turn to that state, someone very familiar with it. Andra Gillespie is joining me from Emory University, where she is associate political science professor. Andra, always great to have you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And when we consider this notion that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are not just investing time and resources in Georgia, they're specifically going to more rural areas of the state that have a high concentration of Black voters. Is what actually is putting Georgia in play for them?
Well, Georgia's in play because the public opinion polls suggest that Vice President Harris is doing better than President Biden was when he was the candidate. So Joe Biden could still make the claim that most polls had him within the statistical margin of error of Joe Biden, of Donald Trump, excuse me. But the trajectory was headed in the wrong direction. And it was very likely, because there were some polls that were indicating it in June, that there were going to be more polls where Donald Trump was going to be clearly ahead of Joe Biden. So statistically outside of double what the margin of error was. Since Kamala Harris has entered the race, there have been a couple of polls that have suggested that she's ahead, but all of these polls put Biden or Harris and Trump within a couple of percentage points of each other, which is clearly a statistical tie. So that suggests that Georgia is still in play. Now, that being said, Georgia still has more Republicans than Democrats in the state. And so if Kamala Harris wants to win the state, she's got to have a massive mobilization campaign that does better than Donald Trump's machine does and gets every possible Democratic voter out. And so what that means is you cannot just concentrate on Atlanta and think you've done your job. You've got to find Democratic voters wherever they are. And the truth is that they're all over the state, and Atlanta isn't the only blue spot in the state of Georgia.
Well, and when we consider who those Democratic voters actually are, who they might be, it is, of course, worth noting that Georgia does have one of the highest Black populations of any state in the country. How much of what Harris needs to do is appeal to that demographic specifically when they were not as supportive of Joe Biden, it seemed, in this cycle than they were in 2020?
Yeah, if you don't have strong support amongst African-American voters, so that's not just in terms of vote choice, the percentage of Black voters who support the Democratic ticket, but it's also in terms of voter turnout, you're doomed to failure because Black voters make up more than half of all Democratic voters in the state of Georgia. So you have to have that strong base of support, and then you have to build on it. So that does include college-educated liberals in the metro Atlanta suburbs. That includes Latino voters who are spread across the state and might not necessarily be in the urban centers in the state. That includes Asian American voters in the suburbs. And so this idea that you have to campaign across the whole state and make sure that you overperform everywhere is going to be the ticket to Kamala Harris being able to win the state. If she can't do this, then she's not going to win the state.
Well, so let's talk then about her opponent who could win the state. Donald Trump, of course, was within 12,000 votes roughly of Joe Biden in 2020, but ultimately lost it. Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, who has had some difficulty with his relationship with Donald Trump, or maybe it's Donald Trump who's having difficulty navigating the Kemp relationship, Andra, given what went down in 2020. Brian Kemp is obviously a very popular figure in Georgia, and that's borne out in polling we're seeing just today. How do we need to consider that relationship and what Donald Trump needs to do in regard to Brian Kemp to get those who might support him, Kemp, the governor in Georgia, on Donald Trump's side?
Well, the issue with Donald Trump's ire was is he was lashing out publicly against somebody whose political machine he needs in order to be able to win the state. And so many people argue that it was self-defeating for Donald Trump to, 4 years later, and even 2 years after his own gubernatorial candidate lost to Brian Kemp in the primaries, it didn't make sense for Trump to continually attack Brian Kemp, who was a popular governor in the state. So we've seen a rapprochement. Brian Kemp is still a Republican. He's still probably going to support the Republican ticket, regardless of what happens in his relationship with Donald Trump. And many of us in Georgia think that he harbors higher political aspirations for the U.S. Senate. So he wouldn't want to alienate the Trump base, who he's going to want to support him in a Republican primary. And so what we see here is just a pragmatic meeting of the minds. Brian Kemp is going to support Donald Trump. He's fundraising for him, and he's going to avail former President Trump of his mobilization operation. And again, this is because whichever side does the best job of getting their people out is going to be the one to win. And so Republicans still have a margin in the state. They still have a buffer, but it's not as big as it used to be. So you cannot have lackluster turnout amongst Republicans and expect to be guaranteed a victory in the state in the way that you might have been able to bank on that 20 years ago.
Well, I did catch up with Governor Kemp at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee earlier this summer, who did make it clear that he is supporting Donald Trump. He wants him to win Georgia, but has said then and said repeatedly even now that there is really no real path for Donald Trump to win if he doesn't win Georgia. How should we be considering the map here? The way it has expanded, Andra, it seems, for Kamala Harris to some of these Sunbelt states, Georgia inclusive, and how now that may shift strategies for both campaigns, Trump included.
Well, I mean, so if we think about the wall and we think about the seven competitive states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, the Sunbelt states actually contribute fewer electoral college votes to the margins. And so most analysts assume that Donald Trump has already banked about 219 electoral college votes. Georgia has 16 of those votes. It shares second place in terms of being the largest share of votes of any of these remaining battleground states. So North Carolina is certainly in play. He would need both of those and Arizona and Nevada to be able to get over the hump to 270 electoral college votes. That's assuming that Kamala Harris wins the Rust Belt states. So, it's Donald Trump's path to victory will probably almost by necessity require that he win 5 states. Pennsylvania is always going to be the plum prize because it's the largest of those states. And if you win Pennsylvania, then if you win the larger states, you can take 4 of those states. But if Arizona is going to be part of this discussion, then and if Nevada is going to be part of this discussion in terms of a must-win state, that actually probably puts the probability of needing 5 states in order to be able to carry the math.
Yeah, Andra, I caught up on this show yesterday with Laura Trump, the co-chair of the RNC, who told me that she does see margins tightening in the state of Pennsylvania, and they're considering investing more resources in that state as a result. I do want to talk as well, before we let you go, Andra, about the interview that Harris and Walz will be sitting down for together within the next hour. It will, of course, air this evening. What is it that Kamala Harris is going to need to most answer for in this interview for Georgia's and voter who may not yet be decided whether or not they want to vote for her, and frankly, undecided voters in these key states across the board?
Well, she's been attacked a lot about flip-flopping on issues, so she's going to have to explain her evolution on issues, and it's going to have to be credible. The big thing that she's going to have to do is she's going to have to speak clearly and not make gaffes and present herself as relatable and ready to lead. I think this is still very much going to be a campaign about vibes, in part because character, I think, can be characterized as a vibe issue about how candidates are going to make you feel. And so she's going to have to present that case as well. But basically, she's going to have to present herself as being able to handle tough questions that she hasn't seen before, so that she can counter the Republican argument that she's slippery and that she's basically kind of, a shadow type of candidate who really has no substance behind her.
Just really quickly, Andra, obviously we here at Bloomberg TV and radio want to focus on policy. Policy specifically is where our interest lies, and we're hoping maybe we'll get answers from Kamala Harris on some of that tonight. But is it going to be about policy in this election, or can someone actually win on vibes alone?
part of the issue with vibes is making sure that you're conveying empathy and that you understand the problems that the average American voter faces. And so you are going to have to name check issues. I think it becomes a question of how much detail do you need to provide in order to be convincing. And so I don't necessarily know that all voters are going to be looking at white papers and they're going to be looking at the specificity of policies, but they do want to hear that you've thought about some issues and that you have some reasonable ideas for how to tackle those issues and that you can communicate that effectively.
All right, so maybe the vibes have to be justified. Andra Gillespie,
yes,
always great to have you. Thank you so much for joining. Associate Political Science Professor at Emory University.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we are always keeping track of the latest polling, including a new poll that came out today from Fox News that looks specifically at the Sun Belt states. This was a poll done in the aftermath of last week's Democratic National Convention in Chicago and after RFK Jr., of course, who was a third-party candidate, suspended his presidential campaign and endorsed Donald Trump. And what this Fox poll finds in the Sun Belt is as follows. Kamala Harris up by 1 point in Arizona. In Georgia and Nevada, it's Harris up by 2 points. Donald Trump, however, is up by 1 point in North Carolina. Now, I would note all of these figures are within the margin of error, but they still point to an incredibly tight race in some of these states that up until roughly 6 weeks ago, it looked like they were Donald Trump's to lose, as Joe Biden was polling much more poorly than Kamala Harris is now in these states, including, of course, North Carolina, which also happens to be the home state of the co-chair of the RNC and Trump's daughter-in-law, Lara Trump. I talked to her about it yesterday.
Yeah, well, listen, North Carolina is definitely a state where we've seen some movement. It looked very positive for Donald Trump in whenever he was going against Joe Biden. It still shows Donald Trump up on Kamala Harris, but we want to make sure that we increase that lead. So we certainly are prepared to put more money into that state.
So for more on the state of the race and the states in which more resources are being deployed by both campaigns, our political panel joins me now. Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, Republican strategist, and Bloomberg Politics contributor, together with Kristen Hawn, Democratic strategist and partner at ROKK Solutions. Rick, I'll come to you on this first, as you obviously have plenty of experience deciding how to allocate resources. Is it North Carolina where Trump and the RNC need to think about spending more money? Is it Georgia where Harris and Walz are today? Is it all of the above? And how do they do that when they don't have the cash advantage right now?
Yeah, it's a tricky situation for the Trump campaign. As you have been pointing out, this new Fox poll shows an 8-point swing in a month to Harris from Trump. This is really bad news. One, because trajectorily they're on the wrong path. They're losing support rather than gaining support. And two, as has been mentioned in this broadcast already today, Georgia is critical to Trump's path to 270 electoral votes. And so he's got the electoral vote math going feverishly right now, because they're trying to figure out what could we string together in order to be able to find that magic 270. And just a month ago, he was sitting on a pile of those options, and he probably had 5 or 6 ways of getting to that magic number, whereas before the switch, very few. So it's still very much focused on Pennsylvania. The Trump campaign's pouring resources into there. But the reality is, as you point out, Kailey, they can't compete dollar for dollar on TV. And so they've got to get Donald Trump out of Mar-a-Lago and onto the campaign trail where they can dominate the news media. And, yesterday he had no campaign events. And so, today he'll be traveling to a couple of the, states, Wisconsin and Michigan, that are critical, but he can't take days off. They don't have that kind of optionality. They've got to focus him on doing more with less. And I don't see that strategy being employed right now.
Well, on the subject of trying to do more, the Financial Times just reporting that J.D. Vance, of course, Trump's running mate, is now urging Peter Thiel, of course, the tech billionaire who Vance has a longstanding relationship with, to get off the sidelines and help bankroll his and Donald Trump's bid for the White House, so perhaps trying to inject some more funding into this, give them more resources to compete across these states, Kristen. But just to come to you on kind of this same question, the same arguably goes for Kamala Harris. To what extent should resources be invested most aggressively in the blue wall? Michigan and Wisconsin, as Rick was just talking about, Pennsylvania as well. And then how should she consider spending it in states that aren't necessarily must-wins for her, but might be nice to have?
Well, I think that the path to victory, or the multiple paths to victory, have really kind of expanded since Kamala took over the ticket. So, I think it's obviously extraordinarily important that that we invest in the blue wall. I mean, that just goes without saying. But if you're seeing states where we have an opportunity like Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, I think that with the influx of cash, we're able to go in and spend some resources there. And I'll also point to the, not only the number of events, campaign rallies, they're all over the place. The infrastructure that was originally set up by the Biden campaign is really unprecedented in a lot of these states. So that'll be, we call it, boots on the ground. People knocking on doors is going to be really important in these states. And I know the campaign is investing heavily in that as well.
There's also demographics I want to talk about here. In this Fox poll in the Sun Belt, they find that Harris is receiving 79% support among Black voters and 56% among Hispanics. And there's also a separate poll out today from USA Today and Suffolk University, which is a national poll, so we have to keep that in mind, but of likely voters that finds nationally Harris is up on Trump 48 to 43%. But the demographics are fascinating. With Hispanics, they went from supporting Trump by 2 points to supporting Harris by 16 points. For Black voters, they moved from supporting Biden by just 47 points to Harris now by 64 points. The spread in Black voters between Harris and Trump, 76 to 12%. Kristen, what does that signal to you?
I mean, it signals very good things for the Democrats. We know that, the Black voters have always played a critical role, particularly Black women voters, in taking us over the finish line. If you just have to look back 4 years to the last presidential election between Trump and Biden to see that is true. So I think, this is where you've seen the campaign also with the younger voters prioritizing talking to content creators, because they realize that people are getting their news from all different kinds of sources, not just network television. So, it's an interesting dynamic, one that is positive for the Democrats. And I think that, I think Coach Wall said at the convention that was right. I mean, it was anecdotal. He was talking about, driving down the field, we're down by a field goal, but needing to persist, that's going to be really important going forward.
Rick, if Donald Trump wants to arrest the swing back toward Harris that voters of color seem to have underway right now, how should he do so? What is the message that actually matters to these groups? Obviously, neither of them are a monolith that should go said, but how could he reach back out to them and get the support that he was gaining when Biden was still the Democratic nominee?
Yeah, he's still got to appeal to them on economic factors. We know from the focus groups that we've seen all throughout this election that especially young Black men felt like they had more disposable income in the 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency than they've had in the Biden presidency. He's got to keep hammering home those economic message to that group specifically. And look, I mean, Kamala Harris still doesn't have the numbers that Joe Biden had on election day in 2020, right? This is a big shift back to the Democratic base for a lot of these voters, but she is still subpar when it comes to the winning margins that Joe Biden had. And of course, we know he only won by a fraction of a percentage point in most of these states where he declared victory. So this is still an incredibly close election. And I do think that the Trump campaign is posed with a real dilemma, which is, do we go after those persuadable young men, African-American who lives in exurbs without college educations, or do we try and pump up our white vote in rural America and try to do that as an offset? And of course, that's what you see playing out today in Georgia with the southern swing by the Harris campaign, trying to arrest that ability to let them pump up their numbers in the rural areas.
Well, Rick, to drill down on the idea that it is the economy that ultimately is going to matter most for these groups, she obviously is going to have a chance to speak to her ideas of how to better their economic circumstances in this interview on CNN, which she's set to sit down along with Tim Walz with Dana Bash about 15 minutes from now. It's scheduled to be recorded at 1:45 p.m., even though we won't actually see it until 9 p.m. Eastern. When we consider the economic messaging that she's putting out there, these ideas about the middle class, about doing more to address housing affordability and price gouging, are those ideas that can resonate with American voters without them being explained in actually a fiscally responsible sense, without talking about the way in which that may add to inflationary dynamics, or whether or not any of these things are realistic without Congress? How much of that does she need to do, or are the broad strokes enough?
It always helps if these kind of proposals are realistic. But at the end of the day, she is doing something different than what Joe Biden did in his campaign, which branded the economy in general as Bidenomics. It was big. You couldn't get really a fix on what he was talking about. There was all this discussion about growth and our position in the world being an advantage. And nobody understood, like, how does that affect me? So I do think one of the tactics that the Harris campaign has taken is with this housing idea is to say, look, we're actually going to affect you personally. We're going to give you extra cash to buy a house. We're going to give you more pressure on lending agencies to put money into the system. I mean, in other words, they're taking a big amorphous economic improvement that Biden was claiming and saying, here's something that's very specific that you could literally put in your bank account if we're able to put my policies into effect. And that's where it sort of crosses the, do you have enough votes in Congress to do something like that? Is there enough money in the federal budget for it? I mean, you're not going to answer any of those questions till after Election Day. So, it is a tactic. It'll be interesting to see how they parse that out in this interview today with CNN. I have no doubt that will be part of the discussion. Yeah. But at the end of the day, that is her ability to then go local, which is what they need to do to be able to communicate economic terms to voters.
And Kristen, finally, we just have a minute left, but what is the toughest question Vice President Harris could be asked today?
I think that the tough things to address are going to be around immigration, just because, and I'm not saying it's anything that she has done, but it's where we know that the attacks have really landed in the Democrat, for the Democratic Party by Republicans. So I think that that's something, but they'll be prepared. They have been speaking about it very clearly, but that is something that's a major issue that we're going to have to address.
All right, Kristen Hawn, partner at ROKK Solutions, and Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital. Thank you both so much for joining me here today. It's worth pointing out, Kristen's in Vegas, so maybe some gambling going on. Rick has an arcade in the basement or wherever he is. You guys are certainly having fun on this Thursday, but thank you for spending some time with me here on Balance of Power. We still have much more ahead. We'll be joined by Bruen of the Global Situation Room next to take a look at what's happening in the Middle East. So don't go far. This is Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We now cast our eyes toward the Middle East as Israel's military operation in the West Bank continues. The IDF saying today that it's killed 5 gunmen at a hideout in a mosque in the West Bank, and Israel's foreign minister has said some of the operations there could require the evacuation of Palestinian civilians. He went on to say that all of this action is in response to an Iranian effort to, quote, establish an Eastern terror front. The idea that Israel has now gone into the West Bank, perhaps preemptively, if they are to be believed, is something I discussed last night on Balance of Power with former Secretary of Defense William Cohen, and this is what he told me.
The Israelis have made it clear they're not going to wait. They're going to preempt whenever they can. My hope is they don't adopt the same plan of making a desert and calling it peace, to simply level all of the infrastructure in the West Bank and say, now we have peace. I don't think that will work. I think they'll be more specific than in their targeting.
So let's get another take now. I'm pleased to say joining me here in our Washington, D.C. studio is Bruen. He is president of the Global Situation Room and also former director of global engagement at the White House during the Obama administration. Brett, great to see you. When we consider what we're seeing happen in the West Bank, how do you read this move on the part of Israel? What does it signal about the way they feel, or the status they feel is the war in Gaza right now, if they're shifting their energies elsewhere?
Well, I think it's important to take into account, Kailey, that they are trying to preempt. They're trying to disrupt efforts by Iran to retaliate for the assassination of an important Hamas leader on Iranian territory. And so what you've seen in Lebanon, what you're seeing now in the West Bank, are pretty precision efforts to try and go after the different axes that Iran has to strike back against Israel. And I think it is important to take into account that what we have seen over the last 24 hours, the last couple of days, has actually been pretty precision in its effort. At the same time, obviously, the collateral consequences could be significant if this operation expands.
Well, and so when we consider the collateral consequences, obviously that is why there has been such uproar, at least here at home, over Israel's ongoing conduct in Gaza in the war with Hamas. How are these things related? If this really is just about preempting Iran, does it have anything to do with that ongoing conflict? I guess it's not entirely possible to separate them.
It's not entirely possible to separate them, and yet I think it is actually an effort that is distinct from what we are seeing take place in Gaza. So it is important on the one hand to understand they are interrelated, and yet in Israel's mind, they are working very assiduously to try and protect civilian lives, to preempt that attack by whether it is the likes of Hezbollah, whether it's the likes of Iranian-backed extremist groups in the West Bank. I think all of this ought to create a greater sense of urgency on the part of the international community, but especially on the part of regional allies to intervene, to work towards pressuring both Israel and Hamas towards a ceasefire deal. Time is of the essence.
Well, and much time has been spent in that effort, Brett, and it's yielded nothing yet. We continually get the Biden administration and various officials saying that we're getting closer. Israel has agreed that they do think they're closer than ever before, and yet nothing has come to fruition. If not now, when?
And as a recovering diplomat, I can say that is one of the tried and true tactics. You publicly project we are getting close. You add that element of press and public pressure to say we need to get this thing done. And yet, time and time again, I have said it multiple times on Bloomberg, it felt like we were close. We were at the 5-yard line. And yet the funny thing about these kind of negotiations is you can be at the 5-yard line, you get a penalty, and you go back another 10 yards.
So is this over-optimism or being disingenuous?
I think, quite frankly, it is a degree of optimism on the part of the Biden administration that really, really wants this deal. But, on the other hand, things happen. All, of the events of the last year have shown how, whether it's Iran, whether it's the likes of Hamas, Hezbollah itself, or other actors, the Russians, we have seen factors and events overtake the best laid plans, and that consistently has disrupted efforts at trying to push us closer to that deal. And obviously Netanyahu himself has his own designs on power.
Well, that's very true. There's domestic pressures on him to consider. I do want to talk more about Iran, though, not just because we are still awaiting potential direct Iranian retaliation against Israel, but also because the UN's nuclear watchdog said today that Iran has further increased its stockpile of uranium enriched to near weapons-grade levels. Brett, how concerned should we be by that news?
I think we ought to be concerned. We also ought to remember that it didn't have to be this way, and that by pulling out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, what former President Trump did was effectively set the clock ticking towards Iran restarting those programs and getting to weapons-grade uranium, which is this ought to be a 5-alarm fire that is sounding in foreign capitals around the world, because the notion that not only Iran, that Iranian proxies and other countries could have access to weapons-grade uranium is really, really dangerous, and it ought to push us towards, and tonight we'll wait and hear from Vice President Harris in terms of what her foreign policy will be, but it ought to push us back to the negotiating table, not just for a ceasefire with Hamas, but also a return to the JCPOA.
Well, I'm glad you raised that interview. She's going to be sitting down for it. In fact, she might already. It was scheduled to begin at 1:45 Eastern. How does she need to address the Middle East? What kind of policy do you hope she says she'll pursue?
One that is distinct from Biden. It is important.
Okay, so there will be some daylight between them.
There absolutely needs to be, both for domestic political consumption, but also for the foreign policy necessity. I think our allies, as well as our adversaries, need to hear from her that she is going to deviate when it comes to issues like Israel. She's going to deviate when it comes to issues like how she handles major challenges, the Afghan withdrawal, obviously, just having marked the third anniversary. She can project a different policy from Biden. And I think one thing that's important for observers is we need to see a different team in place. This cannot be the same figures that governed foreign policy over the last 3.5 years.
Well, because you raised the Afghanistan withdrawal, obviously Donald Trump has been making a big deal out of that this week as we mark 3 years since that happened. He was in Virginia on Monday, paying tribute to the 13 service members who died in the suicide bombing there. How should we be considering the role of the vice president in that? Because he has put a lot of blame on Kamala Harris for the chaotic nature of that withdrawal. To what extent is it deserved?
I've sat in the Situation Room with then Vice President Biden, and quite frankly, the vice president doesn't hold a whole lot of sway over these major foreign policy decisions. Yes, they have a voice, but they are one voice of many. The defense secretary, the secretary of state, the director of the CIA, all of those, quite frankly, hold greater weight than the vice president. And Vice President Harris has not played a major role on foreign policy. Now, obviously, that's also going to be a criticism that Trump and his allies are going to level.
What are the qualifications?
Well,
if that's true.
And yet she's had the benefit of 3.5 years of working on these issues. And, that is some of the best training that you can get in the Situation Room. I think, quite frankly, her service during the last 3.5 years, her interaction with international leaders is far better preparation than J.D. Vance will have gotten, in his short tenure in the Senate.
Fair enough. He was just elected 2 years ago. On the subject of Harris's experience, this is actually, we heard Jake Sullivan addressing this in his trip to China this week. The national security advisor, of course, talked about how Harris is prepared, that she's interfaced with Chinese leaders before, but also seemed to signal that she will bring continuity when it comes to China policy from what the Biden administration policies have been. Will there be daylight between the two of them on this issue?
I don't think so, because quite frankly, it has been a successful policy. And it also is the continuity from a Trump policy, which has been pretty hard when it comes to sanctions, tariffs, and just an overall more aggressive stance towards Beijing that tries to get the message across to Xi Jinping, to others in China, that the U.S. is done with being pushed around. We had that for too many years on an economic front, on a political front. We're seeing the consequences of it in the South China Sea with these literal crashes between Chinese Coast Guard vessels and the Philippines Navy, or even just maritime vessels. It has got to stop. And I think what we're seeing in signals from Beijing is that they are ready to turn the page on this because obviously the pressure has started to mount domestically on Xi Jinping.
Do you think Beijing would prefer the outcome of a Harris presidency or a second Trump one?
It's interesting. Beijing likes predictability. They like stability. I think that Harris will be tough, but she will be predictable. So that is not to say that she's going to go any easier. The challenge with Trump, and this is important, I think, to bear in mind. I was just in London last week talking with your colleague Kristen, and one of the questions that came up is, isn't Trump better for business? The problem with Trump in business is you don't know what he's going to do from 1 minute to the next, from one X post or Truth Social post to the next. And I think, especially on the foreign policy front, foreign leaders came to understand that at least there were some guardrails. There were, the likes of Chairman Miley. There were the likes of the former Secretary of Defense under Trump, Mark Esper.
Yeah.
All of these were figures who they could guarantee were going to be an emergency brake on Trump's more ill-considered tendencies. They're not going back into a Trump administration by all accounts. And so we find ourselves in much riskier territory. And a lot of foreign leaders right now are trying to figure out who would be a Secretary of State, who would be a Secretary of Defense. And the options up there aren't great ones.
Do you have an idea of who the options might be for Kamala Harris?
Well, it's interesting. I think Harris would and should lean more on experienced diplomats. We ought to see folks who have spent time in multiple foreign tours because, at the moment with wars in Ukraine, wars across Gaza, and risks around the world, this is not the time for amateur ambassadors. This is not the time for somebody who donated a lot to a political campaign becoming the ambassador to London or Berlin. We need folks who have the requisite experience, who understand the sophisticated kind of strategies that have to be deployed right now. That's not what we saw all the time from Biden. We saw, unfortunately, a reversion to a lot of those old political party favors that were being handed out. And quite frankly, friends who still are at the State Department, who still serve on the National Security Council, have said there were too many of these political appointees. And I think it was an effort, if you will, at trying to mark a departure from the Trump administration. Harris needs to go back to some of that institutional knowledge and experience within our national security structure.
We've got a minute left. Would you join a Harris administration?
I would not. I have served my time over 12 years. I'm not looking for another stint in government.
All right. Fair enough. Brett Bruen, of course, now with the Global Situation Room where he is president. Thank you so much.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Welcome back to Balance of Power, where we're keeping tabs on domestic politics, but geopolitics this week as well, especially as U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is wrapping up his 3-day trip to China. He actually met on his final day with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the first time those two have met one-on-one. And it set the stage for a call between President Xi and President Biden that they say could happen in the coming weeks. This is, of course, as the two countries work to keep relations stable ahead of the presidential election, when, of course, a new president will be chosen and potentially China policy could change when one is. Now, Jake Sullivan did say today that Kamala Harris has experience dealing with Chinese leadership, saying that she would continue the China policy implemented by Biden, or at least signaling that. And then, of course, there's Donald Trump to consider, who has threatened a 60% tariffs on all Chinese exports. And his China policy is included in a new piece in Foreign Policy. It's authored by Gabriel Sheinmann, executive director of the Alexander Hamilton Society, who writes, and this is a quote, "The strength of the U.S. economy would give Trump the leverage to strike the fair and reciprocal trade deal he seeks." Going on to say those dynamics may lead to a far broader trade war with and decoupling from China. I'm pleased to say Gabriel is joining me now for more. So we have seen this administration, Gabriel, and welcome to Balance of Power. It's great to have you. Take pains to not say decoupling, to talk about diversifying or friendshoring, but not decoupling. Isn't decoupling a dangerous thing?
Thank you for having me. No, it's not a dangerous thing. I think what's actually a lot more dangerous is continuing on the autopilot of policies that we are right now and have been for nearly 40 years. I think that you can use different words for it: decoupling, diversifying, nearshoring, offshoring, friendshoring, whatever it is. But I think at the end of the day, the Chinese government does not play fair a number of its trade deals and has sought to establish leverage over the American economy and American society in a lot of ways. And one of the things, not only the first Trump administration, a putative second one, and to some degree, I think the Biden administration as well, is how do they deleverage? How do they make it enact policy in such a way where the U.S. economy is not under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, but couldn't that make the U.S. economy once again under the thumb of inflation if you do have a decoupling from such a major trade partner where cheaper goods do tend to come from? And if you have high tariffs on those exports that are still coming to the U.S., all of that raises costs, right?
Yeah, unquestionably. And I think you've seen both the Biden administration and then the Trump campaign now talking about how actually it doesn't raise costs. That's just not true. It absolutely will raise costs on the cost of good in the United States and ultimately possibly on the cost of living as well. The flip side of that, though, is what are you giving up in return? And the idea is the concern is that for national security reasons, where we are not able to control the supply chains of core components for our military. We're not able to have full control in the supply chains of core components for our pharmaceuticals. I think people remember during the early days of COVID how there was a mask shortage in the United States. And lo and behold, something like 70% of the masks were being produced in China. And so these are bargaining chips that they have used and leveraged against us in important situations. And so while it may indeed cause an increase in prices for quite a number of American household goods, especially if Donald Trump wins and pursues the pretty large tariff policy he's talking about in China, the flip side of that is also be able to reclaim a sense of kind of national independence and national sovereignty on a lot of these issues.
Well, on this notion of sovereignty, it is worth noting that it's not just the economic considerations when it comes to the China relationship to talk about here, but more geopolitical ones as well. For example, Donald Trump did an interview with some of my colleagues in a Bloomberg Businessweek piece earlier this summer, suggesting he thinks Taiwan should be paying the U.S. for any defense. How do you expect policy when it comes to Taiwan and the South China Sea and all these kind of territorial disputes could be handled differently under a Trump administration?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, it is important to note that it was actually under the Trump administration, the first term, where American policy to Taiwan flourished. I mean, it ruffled a lot of feathers, but then President-elect Trump, during the transition time in late 2016 or 2017, took a call with the Taiwanese president, which was unprecedented at the time. The increase of visits to the island, the increase of trade, included in a lot of international forums or attempts to do so. So the United States under the Trump administration broke a lot of taboos, and to the Biden administration's credit, they actually took those and continued it in that way. So there actually is quite a lot of bipartisanship, I think, specifically vis-a-vis Taiwan. At the same time, and I mean, I wouldn't use the words in which Trump used it, at the same time, there is this concern that our allies are just not doing enough or don't seem to take the threats to their own sovereignty as seriously as they ought to. I mean, I think Taiwan is spending something like 2.5% of its GDP on national defense. And while that is higher than a lot of our European allies, it is still not commensurate where it needs to be, given the threats that they face on a daily basis from Beijing. And so I do think that there is a need for us to be able to encourage our allies to spend a lot more on their defense than they already are.
Well, and of course, and you kind of alluded to this, Gabriel, that doesn't just go for the Asia Pacific, right? You're talking about Europe and NATO here. Donald Trump has suggested those in NATO not paying their fair share may not get requisite support from the United States should the need arise. How do you think that alliance actually would be different? Do you think Article 5 would still stand in Trump 2.0?
I think it absolutely would still stand. And you know that by looking at the record. So first, under Trump 1.0, the Trump administration actually welcomed 2 new nations into NATO, neither of which at the time actually met their 2% of GDP spent on the military's obligations. So despite the rhetoric, the record is different there. The Trump administration actively wanted to move U.S. forces further east in Europe. This is before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and talked about extensively, in particular in Poland and the Baltics, to be able to do that. That's a greater commitment in that way. And although it might come across as haranguing, when Trump took office the first time, I think there was only 5 out of then 28 NATO members that met their 2%. When he left office, it was 10. And now I think we're at 20 out of 32 and next year there. And in a speech he just gave earlier this week, he established a policy saying that rather than a 2% floor, it actually should be increasing to a 3% floor. And I don't think it would be that crazy that if he were to be elected president at the next NATO summit, which would be in June 2025, that he actually might even be able to declare mission accomplished on a number of those things. And so I actually think the trend lines are such that there's starting to be some rearmament in Europe as a consequence of concerns about American withdrawal and obviously concerns about the threat from Russia. The Europeans are picking up a greater share of the burden. They contribute the majority of actually aid to Ukraine, not the United States. And so for all those reasons, I actually think that Trump 2.0 is likely to solidify our alliances with Europe rather than abandon them.
Well, as you raise Ukraine here, Donald Trump has maintained that he could end the war in Ukraine in one day. Gabriel, is that credible? How would he do that?
I think that's a rhetorical flourish. So I think ending the war in 24 hours is not there. But if you actually follow the next sentences that he says after that, how would he do that? What does he say? How did he do? He said basically that he would turn to President Zelensky and say, you got to negotiate with Putin. And if you don't, maybe we'll cut you off. But then he said he'll turn to Putin and say, if you don't actually negotiate an end to this deal with Zelensky, we're going to double the amount of arms that we give to the Ukrainians. So the Russians are the ones that actually have not been willing to negotiate at all because they want all of Ukraine. They see it as a half nation. It's pretty evident from Putin's rhetoric there. Whereas the Ukrainians, obviously they want the Russians to withdraw from their sovereign territory given their aggression, but they've been trying and open to negotiation in different ways. So again, the 24 hours thing is a bit of a rhetorical flourish, but the concept here is that the Trump could be expected to actually put a lot more pressure on Putin to be able to do it. And, maybe you'll get to this, but American energy policy is a perfect example of how to be able to do that. The current administration has been trying to restrict American fossil fuel production, American fossil fuel exports, even though America is functionally an energy superpower. We've never produced or exported more oil and gas than ever before. And under a Trump administration that I think is pretty clear about these things, if you can bring more of that to market, you can dilute the Russian economy or dilute the pressure or the leverage it has the European economy, then it actually puts more pressure on the Russians to be able to negotiate.
Just to follow up on that, Gabriel, as you know, we are producing a record amount of oil and natural gas. So what exactly is it that we think more will be produced in the U.S. under a second Trump administration, or that he will just handle the exporting of it differently, is what you're saying?
I think it's both. I think to give you an example, the Biden administration, I think it was 6 months ago, put a moratorium on new LNG gas export licenses, for example. The Biden administration, because of its concern over climate change, has been trying to more or less kill demand for fossil fuels and basically kill the combustion engine in a lot of different ways. Gas prices in the United States today are roughly $1 more than they were, pre-COVID, let's say, under Donald Trump because of a lot of these policies. And so I do think that by basically reducing regulation, cutting back on a lot of these subsidies for electric vehicles and cars, things that Trump has pledged to be able to do, you're actually going to see more demand, which is going to lead to more supply, which is going to lead to more interest, especially overseas in Europe and so forth.
Drill, baby, drill, I think is what this might come back down to. Gabriel, thank you so much for joining. Great to have you. Gabriel Sheinmann, Alexander Hamilton Society Executive Director. We appreciate your time.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
It is worth pointing out also in that Fox poll that I was mentioning, it does find that voters in the Sun Belt still give Donald Trump the edge on the economy. And in fact, 4 in 10 of them say that the economy is the most important issue for them when they are casting a vote for president. We, of course, got some news on the U.S. economy today, and it was better news than expected. Upward revision to GDP growth in the second quarter. It grew at 3%. That's up from the previous estimate of 2.8%. And of course, the consumer engine that's driving that, you look at personal spending, also revised higher, 2.9%. The prior estimate was 2.3%. So let's get into some of this now and more on the economic policies of these candidates. In addition to that, Lindsay Owens is with me. She is Groundwork Collaborative Executive Director. Welcome back to Balance of Power. Lindsay, it's always good to have you. Obviously, the data we got this morning is backward looking. It's taking a look at the second quarter. We are now most of the way through the third at this point. But does this help put to bed any notions of a potential growth scare that may have arisen, especially in light of the latest jobs report?
Yeah, look, the fundamentals of the economy are absolutely strong. We have low unemployment. We have inflation that has come down considerably off its peak. By some measures, has already reached the Fed's 2% target. And we have strong GDP growth. But the risks ahead are in two spaces. The first is the continued concerns that many Americans have about the high cost of living. And the second, of course, is that the Fed could be behind the eight ball. We heard last week in Chair Powell's Jackson Hole speech that they're going to cut rates in September. So that's great news. And we just have to hope it'll be deep enough and fast enough to ward off any potential downturns.
Well, and what that ultimate depth of the cut next month could come down to is, of course, the data we have yet to get. Lindsay, we're going to get PCE data tomorrow. We know that that's the Fed's preferred inflation gauge. We have a jobs report coming up next Friday. In addition to that, what picture are you anticipating that these data will paint? Do you think it will be supportive of a 50 basis point cut or potentially send the message to the Fed that they can go slower on the way down?
No, I think the inflation numbers are going to look pretty soft, and I think they will support a strong rate cut of 50 basis points or more.
Of course, Elizabeth Warren, the Democratic senator from Massachusetts, had said she'd like to see 75. I'm not sure that anyone thinks that that's highly likely at this point because it could potentially send a bit of a panic signal, right, Lindsay? If the Fed all of a sudden were to ease dramatically, could that not have some repercussions?
I mean, look, I think Chair Powell was pretty clear in his statement at Jackson Hole that he feels like when he balances the risks of continued high inflation and further softening in the labor market, he's now a bit more concerned about softening in the labor market. So he's sort of thinking about that side of the dual mandate with more granularity and with more focus. So I think if he has effectively softened the ground for a pivot to cuts, and I think if he goes a little further than folks expect, I don't anticipate a huge swing in the markets, but I do think it will send a clear signal that he wasn't kidding when he said the risks are now more skewed towards softening the labor market.
Well, of course, monetary policy is one thing, Lindsay. Fiscal policy is another. And we may get some more clarity into the kind of fiscal policy Kamala Harris might actually pursue if she does win the election in November when she sits down for her first interview tonight on CNN. What does she most need to answer for, knowing that she has given us broad strokes of things she would like to do when it comes to housing or price gouging, but how much more explaining is necessary?
Yeah, so Vice President Harris is going to have to talk to the American people about their number one priority when it comes to the economy, which is the cost of living, the cost of things that matter most, a roof over your head and food on the table. And I think she has a lot to talk about that Americans are going to be interested to hear. And I think she has a lot to boast about in some respects. This week alone, we have had two stunning developments when it comes to our understanding of the high cost of living in America. Friday, the Department of Justice sued RealPage, the largest real estate data company, for price fixing. What they determined in their complaint, I looked at the 100-page complaint over the weekend, is that there has been a vast, widespread conspiracy among corporate landlords to set the price of rent well above market levels, according to RealPage's own materials, between 2 and 7% higher than what you would expect absent their price fixing. And by the way, millions of tenants live in houses whose landlords use RealPage. So this isn't small ball, this is substantial. And her administration's Department of Justice sued on Friday to put a stop to this conspiracy. And I think Americans are going to be really happy to hear that she and the Department of Justice have been cracking down on the corporate profiteering that we're seeing in the housing space. The second thing that we learned is yesterday in the Federal Trade Commission's lawsuit to block the merger of two of the largest grocery giants in the country, Kroger and Albertsons, we heard from Kroger's top pricing official, their senior director for pricing, that Kroger has been passing along higher pricing than is justified by inflation alone for milk and eggs. What he said under sworn testimony is that retail inflation is higher than cost inflation. So the high prices that are coming their way, they're absorbing those, or they're passing those along, and then they're going for more. They're passing along higher prices on milk and eggs. And the Federal Trade Commission is suing to ensure that this merger doesn't exacerbate their market position and their ability to do that on an ongoing basis in food and grocery. And so I think Vice President Harris can take credit for that as well. So I think when it comes to both housing and grocery, what she can do is talk about what she plans to do with 4 more years, but also what she is already doing this very week in her administration to bring down the cost of things that matter most, a roof over your head and food on the table.
And finally, Lindsay, we just have a minute left, but in addition to the price fixing kind of conversation, she also was talking about, for example, $25,000 assistance for first-time home buyers. Those are things that cost money. Doesn't she need to explain the pay-fors as well?
Yeah, that's such a great point. She really has done that already, but I think you're right. She should do that again tonight, and I think the American people will actually be quite pleased with her plans to bring in more revenue to cover investments in their communities, investments in their families. She has endorsed all $5 trillion of the Biden-Harris's budget taxes on the wealthy and corporation. That's bringing the corporate rate back up to 25 or 28%. That's restoring some of the taxes, the tax cuts, on the wealthiest Americans. So I think she's laid out more than enough, in revenue to cover the cost of her key agenda items.
All right, Lindsay, we got to leave it there. Lindsay Owens, Groundwork Collaborative and Groundwork Action Executive Director. Thank you. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.